Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We'll be talking about charting Canada's global role, insights from the G7 and NATO summits. My name is Alexander Landry, and I'm a research fellow with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. I'm going to be your moderator today for what promises to be a timely and thought-provoking discussion specific to Canada's evolving foreign policy in a rapidly shifting global landscape. The webinar actually comes several months following the March 17th panel that I also moderated on tariffs and territorial threats. The importance of the topics obviously to be addressed today have only heightened in the months that have passed. Specifically, over the past few weeks, Prime Minister Mark Carney has had his first major opportunities on the world stage, having both attended the G7 summit as the presidency and the NATO summit. The high-profile meetings he saw offered early signals on how his government intends to reorient Canada's foreign policy priorities. This includes things like the alliance commitments in Europe, navigating great power competition in the Indo-Pacific, and obviously redefining Canada's voice on pressing global issues such as climate change, defense spending, and democratic solidarity. That being said, geopolitical tensions are rising and the global order is becoming increasingly contested. Accordingly, summits like this are crucial barometers for how Canada is going to define its role among allies, partners, and rivals alike under the leadership of the Mark Carney government. The discussion today with the two panelists we have is going to explore key outcomes from these summits and what they reveal about the direction of Canadian foreign policy in the months and years ahead. We're going to frame the conversation around several core themes. These include Canada's commitments within NATO and its defense priorities, the G7's approach to global economic and security challenges, and the strategic messaging of the Carney government early foreign policy moves we've seen. As always, we invite you to share your questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to address them during the Q&A towards the end of the webinar. We are fortunate today to have two distinguished and informed experts joining us to share their perspectives. Dr. Andreas Scotter is Professor of Global Strategy and General Management at the Ivey Business School. And Dr. Zachary Paikin is the Deputy Director of the Better Order Project and Research Fellow in the Grand Strategy Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in DC, as well as a Senior Research Fellow with IPD. So I'm really delighted to have you both with us today, gentlemen, for the important conversation to be hosted here. To get us started, I'd love to give each of you the floor to share your opening thoughts on what you see as the key takeaways from the summits and what they signal about Canada, and really just to open the conversation. So Dr. Scotter, please first.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. As I stated in the written summary, I think this was a good start to invite to broaden the audience during the G7 summit. I thought it was a timely action. I think Canada did well, and the Prime Minister did well in trying to be the bridge builder here. That Trump left the summit early, while everybody was speculating this was not the reason like it was last time. I think that's fair enough, this reason why he left. But I think overall, it was also an opportunity to make sure that Canada is on the map, because the Europeans, and Zach may talk to that more, the Europeans are looking at Canada only when the name Canada comes up, right? That's due to the situation that we have in Europe right now, not a priority really, right? I thought it was fairly well done, but the topics have moved on. NATO, if you want me to comment on this one too, the NATO meeting I think was less effective in a way. Yes, the European commitment was there, but I think what polarizes right now is the world that is headed by, or the Western world that's headed by King Trump right now. And this, how to position ourselves as Canada with the pressures of the trade negotiation right now is crucial. So I leave it there.
No, I appreciate that. And I think it's some good comments, and we'll definitely discuss the NATO summit, especially the communique. 5 paragraphs right in the communique, shortest we've seen since the signature of the treaty. So I'll be looking forward to discussing that and debating if it's really the laser focus of the summit, or really if it was kind of like the back end from the G7 and different meetings with Trump, obviously. Dr. Paikin, over to you, please.
Well, thanks so much, Alexander, for taking the time, and the rest of the IPD team for taking the time to put this timely discussion together. And Andreas, it's a great pleasure to meet you, and looking forward to the discussion, and would like to wish everyone, of course, in advance, a happy Canada Day in the true north, strong and free, excuse me. Let me proceed, and important that we highlight that, by the way, after His Majesty's speech from the throne, I would think. Now, allow me to proceed from a bit of a conceptual standpoint when it comes to understanding what I think the initial direction of the Carney government's foreign policy might be so far. And I'll do this by way of comparison. With Chrystia Freeland's speech, perhaps most significant speech that she gave during her tenure as foreign minister, I believe it was back in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, in which in Parliament, she mentioned that the fundamental principle or organizing principle of Canadian foreign policy was going to be to defend the rules-based international order. That was the conceptual lodestar rather of our foreign policy. Now, what does that mean? In general, I mean, number one, it sounds like you are defending the existing system. When you're defending the rules-based international order, you're defending the status quo. That's what it sounds like. Mm-hmm. Now, that existing status quo is not just something that featured, rules per se. It was also a hegemonic setup, right? The status quo was based upon Western leadership, hegemony. And when I say hegemony, I don't just mean power per se. I also mean term-setting capacity, norm-setting capacity. So in effect, in practice, what this foreign policy, this declarative foreign policy of defending the rules-based international order amounted to was a foreign policy focused on deepening partnerships with so-called like-minded partners. Some of whom are more like-minded than others, but that was basically, when push came to shove and you actually pressed down and tried to understand what's at the root of this foreign policy approach, it was clear that, in our view, we have like-minded partners who are proponents of the rules-based international order, and then there are other countries who are less like-minded, who are opponents, as it were, of the rules-based international order, which I think belies, the reality that this concept, rules-based international order, is not so inclusive after all. It's not a neutral description of the post-World War II multilateral order, but it's something that's a little bit more pernicious to some extent, and that reserves for Western countries the ability to be the unilateral and exclusive term setters in the international order, right? So in practice, that's what it meant. And the natural consequence of that was that we saw the atrophying of our relations with countries that were not like-minded. And in that category, I include both democracies and non-democracies. This is not just about democracies versus autocracies. Democracy versus autocracy is not an accurate description of what is currently happening in global politics right now in understanding the future evolution of international order, right? So we saw, our relations with non-democratic China go into the gutter, and we saw relations with democratic India go into the gutter at the same time, right? Okay, so that's our understanding of, I think, what generally guided, the foreign policy of the Trudeau government, after Stéphane Dion had been removed from his position as foreign minister about 14 months into the Trudeau government after it was elected in 2015. Now, if you listen to Mark Carney, and he had an interesting video recently at the conclusion of the NATO summit in which he explicitly said that, we can lament, the old order, or we can choose to build the new one. And I found that to be something interesting from, his perspective, that he was willing to tackle that, from his perspective, that, the old order is gone. We're no longer committed to defending the status quo order. We're now acknowledging that the old order is gone, and we need to focus on building the new, international order. And so my question that I'd like to pose is this philosophy that Prime Minister Carney has put forward, is that a substantive difference from what we've seen before, or is that a semantic difference, purely a semantic difference? And to get a sense of whether it's substantive or semantic, I think we have to look at the two sort of main strategic aims that the Prime Minister laid out when he spoke at the Monk School a few weeks ago, in which the two aims basically were, on the one hand, we have to diversify our economic partnerships and look for more reliable trading partners. And that's just the reality of the fact that our relationship with the United States has now changed. And to the Prime Minister's credit, he has been very forthright with Canadians about that reality. But on the other hand, he also talked about the need to work with like-minded partners in a whole bunch of fronts, including, when it comes to diversifying our defense partnerships, and so we've seen Canada vis-a-vis the European Union now, sign on to this new Readiness or Rearmament 2030, plan that they've put forward. Now, those two goals, let's dissect those two goals. The first goal, diversifying trading partners. First of all, that requires us to work with non-like-minded countries sometimes, right? To some significant extent. And that will require stable relations with China, with India, to right the ship on those relations. And to the Prime Minister's credit, he's made an effort to do that. He's restored high-level dialogue with the Chinese. He made a point of inviting Prime Minister Modi, and it looks like there has been a reset, not a fully fledged back to square one, status quo ante with India, but nonetheless, there's a significant effort to reset that relationship at the G7 meeting held in Alberta. So to his credit, those things have happened. The other thing about deepening relations in economic terms with the rest of the world is that you need to have a single global order to do that with common trading rules, right? And if you're going to have a single inclusive international order, then that single inclusive order must be inclusive of different perspectives, different value sets, different ideas about how to organize international order. And within that context, we can agree on the rules to do business. But nonetheless, you need to meet the aspirations of rising powers, the political aspirations of rising powers, and the normative aspirations of rising powers in order to make that a reality. So we need to keep that in mind. The second issue about deepening relations, and I've alluded to this a little bit already, but with like-minded partners here, I think the key to test the success of this aspect of Carney's foreign policy is going to be to what extent can we define the boundaries in policy terms very clearly of that like-minded set of partnerships, right? If this is about going back to what, our foreign policy was in the 90s, 2000s, into the 2010s, about having a common conception of order with other liberal states and to promote liberal values, and to have a competition of different visions of international order between the liberal West and the non-liberal West, I think that's a recipe for disaster. I think it's a recipe for the continued fragmentation of the international order into a multi-order world, in which we therefore cannot actually make progress on the first goal, which is to deepen economic relations in a stable fashion, with stable economic, not just economic relations, but to have stable economic relations with rising powers, you need to have stable political relations with them too, right? And the only way you can do that is if you grant a degree of legitimacy to their normative worldviews, right? So it's key that if we're going to focus to some extent in our foreign policy on deepening relations with like-minded partners, it's got to be very clearly defined in terms of the policy boundaries. So if it's about diversifying our defense partnerships and focusing on that aspect of it, because it helps to ensure that the approaches to the Arctic through the Atlantic are more secure, great, fantastic. If it's about this broader political alliance, it's not going to work. To summarize, basically, is this a semantic difference or a substantive difference? It's a semantic difference if we're focusing on sort of exclusively this like-minded partnership issue, across the board on the political front, right? That just takes us back to where we were before. It's more substantive, ironically, if it is more utilitarian, right? If we have a clearly defined place in our foreign policy for the relationship with like-minded partners, right? Because at the end of the day, this idea of a liberal order, right, only makes sense when you have a liberal hegemon. And that liberal hegemon is gone. The United States is not going to be returning to that role even after Donald Trump. There may be a course correction to some extent, but it's not going to return to the status quo anti-Trump. So there's no liberal order in that sense. And if you want to have a rules-based order, as I said, you've got to, make room for diversity within the context of rules-based. So whether it's a liberal order or a rules-based order, we have to acknowledge the need for diversity in our relationship, and that requires us to define very clearly what it is we want to get out of different aspects of our foreign policy and have them become a part of a coherent conceptual whole.
Great. I'm really glad you're bringing up the points right off the bat, considering like values-based foreign policy versus interest-based foreign policy. And I think I fully agree that's what the difference is going to be. And specifically, as you speak to the kind of that liberal international rules-based order there, the liberalism only really works when everyone's kind of playing by the rules. Once you have a couple countries that turn really towards the realism and towards the hard power, as we've seen since General Cavoli's speech in 23 at the Swedish Institute and Security Forum there, it's a return to hard power, right? And you have to pivot back to that and go back to the interest-based foreign policy when we get there. Andreas, happy to get any comments on your end from what we've heard so far.
Yeah, well, Zach, thank you for framing this from the particular global political model order. I usually use three different dimensions when I talk about this, and I come up first from the business and economics perspective more than from the political perspective. Also, I see the three intertwined, and for years I've now talked about the reshaping of globalization, mainly from a business order. And when we look at what was the case, the world was led by pole countries, in North America, US, in Europe, Germany, and in Asia, Japan. And with the rise of BRICS, even though that was not initiated by the countries itself, it became a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. We have, as you said, a world order now that is decoupling very much the US-led model and the China-led model in particular, right? And there are more and more countries lashing on the China-led model because they say, okay, you can talk about freedom and democracy and whatever you want in the US, but the Chinese model works, cheaper products, investment. There's a lot of countries in the frontier countries who look at this very, very differently, even though there is some schizophrenia or conflict in this model because some of the Chinese activities are overreaching. But for Canada, it's a difficult situation. When you go back to the Freeland comment there, that was at the time where the global order has already more or less collapsed down or was at the fringe of that one. And we have less convergence. We have in business in an economic model a much more multipolar, fragmented global growth, right? So all these emerging markets are not growing at the same pace anymore. Even the G7 countries are not all developing in the same pace anymore. We have physical decentralization of value chains right now, which comes through automation and digitalization. We have much more region for region activities. And what on the economic front we have missed in Canada is a active foreign policy to foster international business with other countries. This means the government, look at CETA. CETA is still not ratified fully right now. So I would say not much cheese has been moved ever since, right? So we need from the government much more hand-holding or support is a better word of Canadian business abroad, right? Because it was always so easy and convenient to do business with the United States. And I would say we are almost too late for that to have a significant move towards being less dependent on the United States. And this is worrisome what I see right now. And with all these foreign relationships on the political side, I fully agree. And Canada has a role to play. I said this in my shorter opening statement. But from an economic perspective, I'm really worried. I'm really worried about how we can foster less dependence on or create less dependence on the United States. I think we need to acknowledge that we are extremely dependent on the United States. And if we push against that model, we will, at least for foreseeable future, and I don't, maybe forever, suffer, economically at least.
No, I think that's very interesting. And when we talk about real use cases and just examples, like even just this morning, Finance Canada is halting the tax collection of the digital services tax. And Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne has announced that Canada is soon going to bring forward legislation to rescind the DST. And that's just an example of kind of that pressure being exerted upon us like Friday afternoon and us having to react immediately despite kind of like our domestic priorities. So I think I'd like to pivot that really quickly and ask the both of you, how is Canada going to move forward in reconciling competing domestic priorities with those international commitments and that idea of interest-based foreign policy? Dr. Paikin first, if that's okay.
Well, thanks, Alex. Before I answer that, if I could just make another conceptual point in response to something that Andreas mentioned about, that the international order, was already basically frayed or gone by the time that Freeland made her remark, and that Carney made this remark recently as well, that the old order is gone. And perhaps I didn't weigh on this enough in my opening remarks, but the entire international order is not gone. I think that's important to remember. What's gone is Western hegemony. And that was a feature of the order. But by and large, most powers these days that are from the non-West want in. Much like the West under Preston Manning wanted in, these powers want in. They want to see reforms to the institutional architecture of the order, whether it's to the United Nations or to the IFIs. They want to make the international order more egalitarian, more representative, but they're not fundamentally challenging the order per se. And even Russia, which has been the most revisionist of all the non-Western powers, they still benefit from having a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. So, they want that system, to be upheld. They've egregiously violated international law by invading their neighbor, but they haven't challenged the principle of international law as an organizing principle for international relations in general. They cite international legal, precepts and principles to advance their own interests at times. So, there's an extent to which, even, the non-Western powers can be said to be revisionist. And so I think that's important to note that the existing international order has not fully collapsed. We have a crisis of legitimacy within the international order, or a crisis of authority within the international order. But that's not to say that the entirety of the international order, that all of the features of the international order are gone. And I think that we need to keep that in mind, whether it has to do with rules going forward, if we're going to create, rules and institutions to regulate interstate conduct and to reinforce the existing rules and institutions that we have, or if we even want to talk about liberal order. the liberal order is going to have to evolve as well, right? It's going to have to evolve away from a hegemonic construct, rooted in this hegemony of the West and of the United States, towards other forms of promoting liberal norms and values that still make space for normative and political diversity in the international order. And if we can do that, then we can actually strengthen the resilience of the current international order. But I think we should actually be careful. And here's where I would caution the Prime Minister not to lean too hard into this rhetoric about the old order is gone. Because if we lean too hard into it, then we risk creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? We risk, as I was saying in my introductory remarks, leaning too much into overarching political and ideological partnerships with like-minded powers that will ultimately lead to the fragmentation of order into different competing blocks, and that doesn't serve anyone's interests, including our own, especially our economic interests. So I'd keep that in mind for Canada going forward. Just very briefly, Alex, to answer your most recent question, I think that in terms of foreign policy goals, we have to be very clear and limited as to what those goals are. I think we have to stop with this expansive image of ourselves, in terms of thinking of ourselves as a middle power. That's an idea that dates back to the Cold War. We are no longer a middle power. We have to acknowledge that we have been in decline on the world stage, whether in absolute decline or in relative decline. One could maybe even make an argument for absolute decline, but certainly in relative decline on the world stage as the rest of the world has risen, and we have not invested enough in our foreign policy and in our, the capacities and instruments of our national power. So we're no longer a middle power, and we need to therefore abandon, and I give, Mr. Carney full marks for this so far. We need to abandon all the vocabulary that encourages us, to think of this more expansive role for ourselves, right? Starting with role for ourselves, right? Stop using the term our role in the world. That term needs to go away. We don't have a fixed role in the world. The world is changing. The world has changed. We need to, understand what our interests are in a changing landscape and pursue them ruthlessly, right? That is fundamentally different from a fluffy, perspective or conception of what our role is in the world, and this is who we are, et cetera. We absolutely have to move away from that because it only encourages us to talk big. But at the end of the day, the political support isn't there anymore to actually invest the capacities, necessary to live up to that big role. So let's focus on very clear, fundamental interests and goals that we have, and they can be within the multilateral system, but they should be, limited and numbered, and clearly defined. Pick 3-4 things, that we have to really work on and be, experts at that, the go-to country, on those issues that can really, contribute not only to advancing our interests, but to stabilizing the international order more broadly. And then from there, use that consolidation in our foreign policy space to focus domestically on, really, again, consolidating and growing the fundamental pillars of our national power, which will allow us to exert a more substantial role in pursuit of our interests over the longer term, right? So, economic power is potential foreign policy power, right? So whether it's on immigration, whether it's on infrastructure, whether it's on housing, whether it's on all these issues, we need to be single-mindedly, pursuing a strategy to render more durable the facets of our national power that will attract the right people to come to Canada, that will give people who are already in Canada, a stake in the future, and to believe in the future of the country and to not believe that it's a country that's in inexorable secular decline. And in doing that, you will unleash creative energy in the foreign policy realm over time. But we can't move forward on the foreign policy front by lying to ourselves about how influential we are. In part as well, by the way, because influence is not an end in itself, right? The end goal is to pursue our interests. And so influence is a goal insofar as it allows us to pursue our interests. So we need to define very clearly what our interests are first and make sure that we have the instruments of our power necessary to pursue those interests over time, through the influence that we will have garnered by strengthening our national power and diversifying our international economic and political partnerships. As I've mentioned before, there's no stable foundation in an ideologically pluralistic world for economic relations with rising powers unless there's space for political pluralism as well, and that needs to be a feature of our foreign policy.
Yeah,
Andreas.
the economic, sorry, Alex, but the economic and the political models are, you mentioned them together in a way, but they are not together. They are built upon each other. And while the political model was driving it prior, it's not driving it anymore. It's the economic model that's driving it. mainly. And this is the big problem, right? So what comes first? These grand aspirations or real actions that may be in conflict with the aspirations of Canada and our interests. So where does it start? I mean, we are late, right? We didn't do much on the global economic front over the last 10 years. So we are still in catch-up mode, but we are not really catching up because there's no clear plan forward. We need to ask the hard and tough question and make changes internally in a way that we are better positions to have economic benefits from global collaboration, be it global or be it international, bilateral, or whatever it is, or with other zones. And that's my point, right? So I think you cannot throw everything into one bin. I think the economic model is increasingly more important, and this is against what we have been playing for a long time. This grand, we are the nice guys. We are the ones, as you call it, middle power. We are the ones, that everybody likes, and the other guy with the blonde hair is the ugly guy on the stage, right? Excuse that, but this is exactly what happened, right? But there's no substance to how we move forward economically right now, and I think this has to come. Some tough decisions have to be made.
No, I agree. And this is great because you mentioned this. And obviously, one of the ways that we're leaning into this economic growth is in defense spending, right? So we've had a large amounts of announcements on defense spending. The NATO summit just occurred. I am ironically or a little kind of like surprised that we're leaning into this rearm Europe aspect because I've been preaching this like since I really got into international relations. Like Article 2 of the NATO North Atlantic Treaty, often referred to still as the Canadian Article, does focus on this economic benefit and the non-military cooperation among NATO members. So I'm surprised that we're not leaning into this specifically, considering it emphasizes strengthening free institutions, promoting democratic principles, and still fostering the conditions for the economic well-being to drive kind of the foreign policy and make NATO really more than just a defensive alliance. So regardless of that, leaning into the rearm EU, we missed the boat on AUKUS. We missed our Security Council seat many years ago. I'm curious, like beyond just adhering now to these agreements and potentially leaning into defense spending, what the next step is. Like, are we going to look more at LNG ports again? Like, what else do we have in terms of economic steps to move forward with for Canada, both domestically and from the foreign policy perspective? Zach, you're first to the bat here.
Well, look, I mean, Alex, first I'd take issue in part with one of the things you mentioned in your remark, which is that somehow being left out of AUKUS is like a foreign policy failure, right?
Mm-hmm.
As if, we need to be at every table. This is the idea. If we're left out of certain tables, then it's been a failure. Well, that's not true. We don't have to be at every table. We have to know what our interests are, and then we decide what tables we want to get a seat at.
Mm-hmm.
But is it really all that advantageous for us to be joining an alliance along with the United Kingdom and Australia, that's focused on a region of the world that is important for us in economic terms, but really militarily speaking, we don't have all that much power that we can really project across that vast theater at all. And that AUKUS already, I mean, the relevance of this paradigm, I mean, I don't know if it's going to last all that long. I mean, people are already starting to raise questions about this. So this is one of the things that Canadians really need to and by Canadians here, I mean the Canadian elite need to resist. Right, we need to resist this temptation to sort of think of ourselves as losers if we're not present at every single table around the world. Because the need to be present at every table around the world, first of all, it makes you overstretched. And second of all, it creates this conception, as our former foreign minister, Mélanie Joly, I think very wrongly put it, that Canada is nothing more than a convening power. And we're a convening power because, we're present at this table and that table, we're at the G7 and we're in the G20 and we're in the Commonwealth and we're in the Francophonie, and therefore we're uniquely placed to convene other powers. Well, what are our interests? Are we just bringing countries together, or do we actually know what our interests are that we're going, specifically to pursue independently, in partnership with other countries where we can, but different constellations on different issues, when is necessary. So I'd keep that in mind
of
as
course.
well.
No, that's good. And I appreciate this is what I really come for the debate, right? Is to put things out there so we can go back and forth. So I'd be curious then, as a rebuttal, should we be looking to lean into items that are of interest to us, specifically energy and Arctic? And how do we do that moving forward, considering what those tables look like right now?
Well, we need to name those, right? So when you talk about energy, you see my native Germany, I came to Canada 20 years ago, right? At the time, I was talking about interprovincial, I didn't know that, right? Interprovincial barriers. The first thing I encountered, I was going up to a conference in Banff, and all of a sudden they were talking about that tradespeople in Alberta are now allowed to work in BC and vice versa. And I, as a European at the time, who has lived 10 years in Asia, I've never
Mhm.
experienced this. This is, of course, a Pole can work in France and UK, at the time in the UK, Germany, no problem, right? And we cannot work across the border, even though you're living closer to the next town in BC than, in Alberta. Kind of crazy. We're still having these issues. So the same thing is with energy. It is nice that we think it's cleaner not to refine our oil in our country, right? But we are basically having an Africa problem. We are selling the oil at a discount to Louisiana and to Texas and buying it back at practically world market prices as refined gasoline. I mean, I don't understand that, right? That's an interest for Canada. That's a really substantial interest, and we are hiding. We are a clean country, and that everything is great, and we don't do the dirty work. I think that we need to define what is our interest from that perspective. And I would say I'm afraid it falls down to the economic model that underlies the principles of being the better guys in the group. And I would totally support Zach. We don't need to be at every table, but we need to be at tables we are not at in regions of the world that play an increasingly more important role, with emerging markets making up 50% of global GDP as of this year, practically, right? So these domestic barriers that we are creating, they need to come down in a way that are not in conflict with how developed values we are having, right? Yes, we don't want to have environmental issues in our country. Yes, diversity, inclusion, yes, reconciliation are important values, right? But they cannot be showstoppers in that regard, right?
Mhm.
They sound harsh, but I think that's reality. At the moment, we are extremely dependent on the United States, right? And this will stay. We will maintain this economic dependency on the United States. So how can we carve out, in the spirit of SAC, right, our own interests, right, that we are better and still stick to the values we have put forward in our agenda that makes us not just different, but makes us as Canadians more, satisfied with reaching these goals and values, these intangibles, right?
Mhm. Zach, please.
Can I add, yeah, let me just add one more thing there, because I mean, on the things that you mentioned, Alex, I mean, these are, the Arctic, energy, et cetera. These are, of course, top national priorities. These are things that, Canada can uniquely contribute on and that we have to, move forward on, from the perspective of our national interest. So I won't add anything on that. What I do want to make a point about, and that I really implore, the Canadian, political elite at this point in time to think about, is the immigration question, which has become a real political lightning rod. It's unfortunate that it's become a political lightning rod, because there used to be a great, bipartisan consensus around this issue. But I really need to stress and underline the importance of immigration to Canada's national power going forward. It is a huge source of power and potential power for Canada, without which we are unable, to go back to the model I was presenting before, we are unable to, secure our national interests, right? So you need to develop power in order to generate influence and to use that influence for a specific goal, not as an end to itself, but to achieve certain key interests, right? Okay, so on immigration, it is absolutely imperative that we fix this system, but we should, and part of that, requires, getting numbers to a sustainable level. Part of that involves, housing, et cetera. But you've got to make sure that the different arms of government here are working in unison. And here I think that the Prime Minister has done a very good thing by just issuing one general mandate letter, rather than issuing different mandate letters to each of his different ministries. The different ministries should not be working at cross purposes or separately, just trying to tick boxes about what it is that they need to accomplish. It's imperative that they work together on a common national strategy. We will not succeed in strengthening our national power if we do not continue to have large numbers of immigrants going forward. It's the lifeline of our economy, and we can't sustain high levels of immigration without fixing the housing issue. So these issues go together, they go hand in hand. And fixing the immigration issue, by the way, also is not just about, the tangible issues like housing. It's also making sure we're bringing in the right people, and it's also making sure we communicate the right message. And, we've been focusing, to a significant extent, and, rightly so for a long time, on the mosaic aspect of Canada. It's unique. It is something that, makes us different from much of the rest of the world. We need to push that, of course. It's what allows us to bring together, folks, from around the world, and to live side by side in a society. But that model has been based historically on the premise of tolerance. It's been based on the idea that you can bring people from around the world, and irrespective of where they come from, They put their differences aside. They can be proud of where they're from. They should be proud of where they're from, but they identify first and foremost as Canadians. And what they're proud of most now is the fact that they live side by side with other communities together in peace. And what we've seen in Canada over the past 2 years now almost has been the abandonment of that model in favor of the ultra politicization of many issues. Not exclusively the Israel-Palestine issue. We've seen it on South Asian geopolitics as well. But the Israel-Palestine issue has become really centrally a domestic lightning rod in Canada, and it has eaten away at the foundations of our multicultural model on the basis of tolerance. And so we need leadership at the top that very clearly stresses the importance of peace, order, and good government. And I don't care if you're a liberal or a conservative or a social democrat. In Canada, we believe in peace, order, and good government. And so, people who are coming to Canada need to understand that. Either that's to revert to the previous model of tolerance, in which we basically say you can't go and harass members of other communities, or it's to create a new model, in which we're no longer based on tolerance and we are based on politicization, but therefore it's an opportunity to strengthen what brings us together as Canadians. And therefore, let's not focus on this mosaic, aspect of what makes us different, but let's focus instead on what brings us together and define a new identity as Canadians if we're going to go down the route of politicization. But we need leadership at the top that has to make a decision right now. Are we going to try really hard to restore tolerance, which we've lost, or are we going to move forward towards a new, stronger kind of Canadian identity? Either answer could theoretically be viable, or correct, but there needs to be a decision. You can't not make a decision on this at this point. Multiculturalism itself as a model is relatively recent in Canadian history. It only goes back 50 or so years. Now, proponents of multiculturalism like to say that the seeds were there, in the 19th century with our compromise between English and French, and you had the Irish, and you had, other minorities, the Chinese who were also coming to Canada, and indigenous Canadians, etc. So they like to say that, but let's be honest, as an actual, model for organizing Canadian society that was internalized by the elite, it really was, something that was adopted in 1971 with Pierre Trudeau, consciously so. The situation for other minorities in Canada before the 1970s was not pleasant. It was very common, for signs, to say on restaurants, no Jews or dogs allowed. There were quotas on how many, Jews could, go to universities and certain programs. They couldn't practice in the same, hospitals as regular folk. So, multicultural Canada is only 50 or so years old. Either we're going to strengthen that paradigm, or let's think about what the new paradigm is going to be. But if we're going to, unleash some creative energy as a country, that's not the worst idea, to think about what a new paradigm could be, and to have Canadians, the brightest Canadians, start thinking about that together from all sides of the political aisle.
I'm glad you bring that up. Apologize, please go ahead.
Sorry, Alex, you opened the Pandora's box here, right?
No, it's good.
I would like to support. So one thing, I love the immigration piece, because this is the one I talk about a lot, even here right now, where I'm in Louisville, Kentucky, at this big conference. But here's the biggest issue beside the political, social, cultural integration part. We bring people in, and you said the smartest, brightest, and best contributors. We need to provide avenues for these people to actually get into contributing. The barriers on education, healthcare, and a lot of other dimension, the acceptance of degrees from any country in the world is just ridiculous. We are not even, we're allowing the people in, we're picking them based on qualifications, then they come to the country and they cannot contribute right away. That has been the model of success in the United States until about maybe 10 years ago, where their new immigrants usually contributed relatively more than the average of the existing population. They had a much easier way. And of course, there were a lot at the bottom as well, no doubt about it, plus all the illegal immigration. But we are not making it easy for a large group of professionals to come into Canada and contribute right away from an economic integration perspective, right? And we can talk about the other dimension. I totally agree on the Palestine-Israel situation, but it dates back even before. Look what we have created within the different ethnic groups in India. I mean, from India, we have street wars between different ethnic groups. That is not acceptable in a country like Canada. And if we keep on allowing this, we are not bettering ourselves. We are dividing ourselves more on the inside, I would argue. So Zach, I'm 100% on your side there.
No, it's good, and I'm glad we have agreement. So I'm actually going to pitch this further to you, probably for our last question before we go to closing remarks, because I know both of you have very busy schedules afterwards. I'm glad mandate letters got brought up, and I'm glad we're talking about the need for leadership. And one of the questions actually in the chat is asking where this comprehensive foreign policy review should come from. We've talked beforehand in different webinars, including myself with Zach, about the centralization of the PMO. So I guess the question back to the both of you: who should be driving this leadership? Is it the Prime Minister's office? Do we need to convene some sort of a committee? Should we be bringing in the elite, some senators? Like, who's this going to be that should be driving this holistic review and then pushing it forward? Zach, over to you first.
Sure. So a few things. Obviously, there needs to be leadership from the PMO. And I think that this is, different from the discussion about whether too much power in political terms has been centered in PMO, which it certainly has been. And that's been a longstanding trend for decades. And that has come at the expense of, the role of parliamentarians and being able to do their job. And I think that that's, not just a question of democracy in Ottawa. It's also a question of how effective the federal government is. I think Andrew Coyne brings this up in his excellent recent book, and he's been making this point for a long time that, if you centralize too much power in the PMO, Ottawa itself looks less legitimate to the rest of the country because parliamentarians no longer look like they're there for any particular purpose. So if you want to have a strong federal government that's capable of actually succeeding in moving forward on the policy areas that lie within its areas of competence, which anyone should be in favor of, even conservatives, because conservatives should want the federal government to do its job well within its areas of competence. It doesn't want it to transgress on provincial competencies, but nonetheless, within its areas of competence, it should. Then in that case, there needs to be a rebalancing. But that's separate, I think, from the question here of whether the Prime Minister needs to take a leading role in reviewing our foreign policy. Absolutely. And I think part of the reason why is because our foreign policy review isn't something that can just be conducted by the foreign ministry. This is something that needs to tie different areas of policy together. You need to tie it in with defense. You need to tie it in with AI. You need to tie it in, as I was saying before, the connection between domestic policy and foreign policy. We need to, building a strong economy and a strong, resilient society and unified society, is a fundamental instrument of our foreign policy going forward, especially because the goal of our foreign policy, our national strategy, I should say, rather, should be to reverse, these decades of secular decline that we've been in. And so you can't do that unless you have an all-of-government approach. Not to say that this should be unfocused, but there needs to be a clear, idea of, okay, we aren't what we used to be. How are we going to reverse that process in the pursuit of our interests on the world stage, right? And in the meantime, how can we use levers of our foreign policy that we still have left in order to strengthen the foundations of our national power at the same time? So it's a virtuous circle, right? How can we use trade and develop stable trade relations with both like-minded and non-like-minded partners to strengthen our societal resilience and economic resilience, right? That's something that we need to be thinking about as well. But this is a multi-departmental issue. It needs to move forward. But on the foreign ministry side exclusively, what I would say is that it is essential that Minister Anand remain in her job for as long as possible. It is imperative that Prime Minister Carney not repeat the mistake of both of his predecessors, both Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau, who each went through revolving door of foreign ministers. I think each of them had something like 5 foreign ministers, in the span of the decade that each of them was in power. That's completely unacceptable. You're not able to develop international partnerships and relationships, if you're constantly, being shifted out, because, diplomacy is so much about building relationships, building trust. And of course, you can't oversee reforms, without a long tenure as well. And there need to be serious reforms in the foreign ministry specifically. This is something where, this is somewhere where we need to develop a lot more, subject matter expertise, linguistic expertise. We need to have more diplomats out in the field. We need to generate, a culture where, people are rewarded for proposing bold and new and out-of-the-box ideas. We need to have a civil service across the board, that is much more functionally bilingual. And this is really got to be a priority, I think. I think that if you can't speak, fluent French, you shouldn't be denied any job, because, the reality of the matter is that the majority of Canada, 70% of Canadians can't speak French. But if you can't speak French and you still have premise, then the government should pay for you for a year or two to live intensively in French and to develop, if not fluent, then at least a professional level of French. That's imperative. In part because we're not going to emerge from America's shadow unless we figure out ways to think for ourselves in the world, And we can't, it's much harder for us to do that in the language that the Americans, speak in and develop their media in, and that we spend all of our time consuming. So let's develop a theory of our own foreign policy, and our interests, in part in French, that we can consume and digest in French, and that we can, present to the rest of the world in a language as well that is our own, and that too many Canadians do not, internalize as actually our own, and is a really important part of our national fabric.
No, I appreciate that, and the French speaking piece is definitely interesting. So it's I'm glad you bring it up, and it's definitely pieces that are specific here. Andreas, thoughts on your end? I know you have to leave soon, so if you have any closing remarks as well, before I pitch this last question to you both.
I 100% agree, but I would like to bring that up what I said earlier. We need to. This is the foreign policy part. I agree. This is has to be fixed the way Zach described it. But what comes at the same time, and we need to fix this internally too. We need. Yes, our provinces are powerful. Yes, we have that federal system, no doubt about it. But we cannot have these forces, playing against each other or playing against the central. And this may sound like an oxymoron, because on one side we don't want to be like the United States right now, but we have to look carefully what is working there and how is this working there, right? And when you look at even all the degrees and whatever has come out here, and how they're being pushed against, and how just the last ruling against the temporary suspension of some of Trump's decrees has been pushed back by federal judges. We need to look. We don't want to have that kind of conflict necessarily, but the provinces are part of that one too, right? And if we don't identify as one Canada in a way, right, this will be very difficult to position ourselves in the world, right? And we need to understand we're not playing here, coming into the game, or we're not running at the front of the pack right now. We are still in catch-up mode, right? But we don't know with whom we are catching up and how we are catching up right now. So I think internally, it's the same thing, right? Fixing us internally so that we are able to be stronger with the foreign policy, economically, politically, is, I think, fundamentally critical before we can do anything. So it's both.
Okay, well, gents, I appreciate the discussion so far. We're going to go into the final thoughts here as we kind of wrap up, and as I'm bringing it back to the post G7, post NATO summit pieces here for the Mark Carney government. I'm curious now, what are the next steps? What should we be looking at specifically? And I'll frame it as this question. If you were personally advising the Prime Minister, what is your top strategic recommendation for the next 6 months leading to the Christmas timeframe? Zach, over to you, please.
Top recommendation is don't wait to fundamentally rethink the foundations of our foreign policy. Don't wait to see what happens in our relationship with the United States and how the trade negotiations go first. That makes us into a reactive power. And that's what we've been for the past several years, if not decades. We've been reactive, right? Whenever something's going on in the world, our first instinct is to say, oh, what are the Americans doing? What are the Brits doing? What are the French doing? And then, how can we contribute on the basis of what they've already identified as the agenda? Don't be reactive anymore. If we continue to grow the sources of our national power through immigration over the course of the coming decades, eventually we're going to have a bigger population than Britain or France, right? We're going to be one of the leading Western actors at that point, to the extent that the West might still exist or may not exist by then, in several decades' time as a coherent entity. But don't wait. We need to think for ourselves on this. Let's rethink the foundations of our foreign policy, launch our foreign policy review, bring in a whole bunch of different perspectives on this, and be bold and audacious, and not just get into this common, pattern of waiting to see what happens with the United States and then basing everything else on what the Americans allow us to do. Donald Trump is going to punish us one way or another. It doesn't matter if we do something that, we think he's going to like or not like. We saw this, just recently, before, President Trump took office, in which, rather than think for ourselves, we just reflexively aligned ourselves with the American position on Chinese EV tariffs and just imposed a 100% tariff, thinking that, this would earn us some brownie points in the White House. Well, guess what? It didn't earn us any brownie points at all. All right. So let's just, pursue, what we want to pursue, identify our own, foreign policy interests, and do so now, in part because, Prime Minister Carney is at the height of his popularity right now. Now is the time when he's going to have the political capital to make these difficult decisions, and people are just yearning, for change. They are yearning for creative energy to be released, after just decades of stagnation. And, I understand why, the stagnation in part came about is because we didn't want to talk about big national questions anymore after decades of constitutional turmoil. And so people saw, the premiership of Stephen Harper as a welcome respite from that. And I'm not saying that now, is the time, to plunge right back into, this potential, divisive, national unity battle, which, by the way, it may be coming our way, whether we like it or not, because of what's going on in Alberta. But there are other ways in which we can inspire Canadians. And one way is to fundamentally rethink the foundations of our foreign policy and to make them fit for purpose for a world in which, the West is no longer hegemonic. Right, Canada for so much of its history has been free riding on the wealth and growth and ambition of first the British Empire, then the American Empire, and we just sort of got to reap the spoils without doing too much thinking on our own, save for a very brief period of what we like to think of as being the golden age of Canadian foreign policy. Whether that's true or not, from sort of the 60s to the 90s. It's a new world now. It's a post-Western world. So, let's start thinking and let's be open to, an understanding of Canadian foreign policy in which the West and relations with other Western, partners are an instrumental, important component, but a defined and clearly compartmentalized component in a broader strategy that we're going to conduct, in a world that's much, much more diverse than that. And that doesn't mean we have to be everywhere all the time, by the way, again. Right? Our focus should be squarely on those issues where we can contribute the most, and that includes the Arctic. But it does mean understanding that in our relations with rising powers, we cannot proceed on the basis of lecturing them going forward, about what their legitimate role in the world is going to be. They are going to define their role in the world, and they're going to do so aggressively. They have been doing so aggressively. They've been doing so aggressively on our sovereign territory, and we better catch up.
Okay, thank you for that. Andreas, please close your remarks and your thoughts on the immediate need for the next few months.
Yeah, I like that, Zach, very much. It supports also what I said earlier about the multipolar or decoupling world. What we're having right now, these countries are, not looking at us that way anymore, 100%. But I would say what the most important part is doing what Zach just said, having a clear foreign policy, deliver it and move forward, don't stop, but also provide Canadians with a model, right? That's what I found in my conversations always. They don't know where this is going, right? There's no vision, there's no clarity behind. It's an us against them model that is being posted right now, which is not ideal, right? So that's fine to react to tariffs by not buying American or by trying to buy Canadian whatsoever, but that's not the model to move forward in the world to pursue our own interests. We really need to provide a model for Canadians that they can see what Canada is about, what they can contribute, and how they actually connect with a new world order, with a new world, right? Which is not just going to Cancun, Mexico, or to Florida, or to Arizona on vacation because it's ever so convenient, right? So we need to understand that the average Canadian is also engaging more with the world and sees what's going on. This has not been done. And as Canada, we need leadership that provides a model for that one, right? And I would say, I'll correct myself earlier because I used that middle power language. I would much more align with Zach right now. The middle power language is actually not helpful, 100%, right? I actually used more the term bridge builder. And I still think that is possible. That's not the main role. I would 100% now agree the role is self-interest in a functional Canadian values-based way, 100%.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the thoughts here as well. It has been an engaging webinar today. We've definitely straddled the line a little bit between realism and politics, domestic and foreign policy. And the Institute of Peace Diplomacy is always privileged to welcome you both to discuss these important issues. So thank you both, gentlemen, especially for taking the time out of your busy days to get to this. Specific to our guests and viewers, we hope you've taken something away from the webinar. We're remaining open to fostering discussion pertaining to these items specifically. There's going to be future webinars. You've probably seen there's been more over the past couple of weeks that have been popping up, especially late than never. You can further engage, obviously, online to the IPD website, as well as we continue sharing the actual media posted on the IPD website from our different research fellows and affiliated fellows, but as well as what they're publishing elsewhere as well throughout the Canadian and international ecosystem of publications. Again, wishing you all a happy and restful Canada Day tomorrow. Zach did steal my thunder in the beginning for that. For the Institute of Peace Diplomacy, I'm Alex Landry, wishing you all a great rest of the day, and thank you again for being aboard.
Merci beaucoup. Bonne fête du Canada.
Au revoir.